What's up guys? Today I thought we'd take a look at the Mezzabarba Trinity. So grab yourself a hot, steamy, preferably caffeinated beverage and let's dig into it. The Trinity is an amp that I've had for a few weeks now. Up until very recently, I've been using my Dan Gower modded Marshall JCM 800 for everything I do live. And you know how it is when you're a guitar player? You just get a hankering for something a bit different. So I'd seen a bunch of videos online about the Trinity, a lot of which came from Eric Steckel actually, who's a phenomenal guitar player. If you haven't heard of him, go check him out. He's got some incredible like blues feel and some serious chops. The big thing that I look for in an amp is not needing to push the front end. In my head, and it's a controversial opinion, if I need something in front of the amp to push it harder, it's not the right amp. Plenty of you will disagree with me. There's a comment section just below where you can leave your views on this. But that was a big part of why I went to Dan to get my Marshall modded. Anyone that's played a JCM 800 knows that even when you crank it, the amount of gain that you get is moderate at best. It doesn't have that searing, soaring lead that I really like. Dan did an incredible job, and I want to be really clear, this is not a replacement for my Dan Gower amp. I still absolutely love that amp. I just need, you get the craving for something different. This is where I arrive. So I don't use amps at home. I only use amps when I play live. Anyone that's ever owned a 100 watt head will know that trying to use an amp with that much wattage at home is basically impossible. Fortunately today, we're going into a two notes torpedo. I've got it running into the wall of sound. Cab sim, just a standard Brit Vint C, whatever that is. It sounds a lot like my cab, which is just a V30 loaded bag cap, and it's mic'd up with a 57 and a 121, very similar to what you'd do in a live environment. So I'm hoping this comes out as a reasonably good representation of what the amp sounds. I have A/B'd them between the cab and the cab sim. Sounds pretty bang on. I should probably also point out there's no EQing going on here or anything funky with the audio. The only thing I'm going to do is add some reverb and probably some delay in post. So the big selling point for me of the Trinity was its 3-channel. When I play live, I'm very dynamic. I use my volume pot a lot, but sometimes you want that mid-gain thing. And the mods that Dan did to my Gower, to my Marshall, include a completely separate clean channel. As well as all the magic that he works with the kind of main distorted channel. It's really dynamic. I can roll back nicely, but sometimes you want a dedicated sort of second channel where you can really kind of give it some welly, but only hit a certain level of gain. And I feel like largely we found that with the Mezzabarba. I went down to Peach Guitars in Colchester a few weeks ago. Shout out Peach. Great guys, really helpful. Had a really good experience shopping there. And we ended up with this. So I thought let's do some tones and see how it sounds. So it's a 3-channel amp. Each channel has a bright cap and each channel has a boost. The bright cap works really well when you're playing at low volumes. Obviously, as you start to crank the amp up, that bright cap becomes less and less impactful. I tend not to use it. I like my amps slightly on the darker side anyway, so I don't tend to play with that. The boost feature is incredible. It essentially hits the front of the amp harder, so it's like putting a boost in front of your amp on a pedal board or something. I don't quite know the circuitry behind it. I don't know if it's engaging another preamp valve. I don't know if it's just ramping up the signal into the preamp. I don't know how it's working. I don't care how it's working. It sounds fantastic. So let's take a look at the clean channel. The clean channel as it stands is channel 1. Now channel 1 is without the boost, is a really high headroom, squeaky clean type affair. Bearing in mind, 2 humbuckers, volume all the way up. If I put a Strat into this, you're going to get a very different kind of experience. And as if by magic, a black Strat appears. So let's do position 4, these 2 pickups. Or the sort of Dave Gilmour position. And the neck. So back to some humbuckers. Maybe if we put the boost on, you'll see how much this kind of starts to gain up. Now let's roll the gain up a little bit. So as you can see, there's plenty of gain on tap just on the clean channel. I like a nice sparkly clean, so I tend to keep the boost off, keep gain about halfway, and you get this really nice, shiny. That is a bit of me all day long. So now let's have a look at channel 2. Channel 2 uses the same EQ section as channel 3, so just bear that in mind when you're dialing it in. It's a mild overdrive without the boost. Really quacky, punchy, AC/DC. Big fan of that. It's got that wonderful kind of quack that I really like. So now we hit the boost, and this is where the lines between channel 2 and channel 3 get a little blurry. Bit of neck. Bearing in mind the drive on channel 2 is set at about noon, so let's crank that up a little bit. So that's got some real thump for channel 2. So now let's get into the fun and games. Channel 3, you know what? It's not as gainy as I thought it was going to be. So for comparison, when I play live and use my Gower, the gain sits at about noon to 1 o'clock. So it's got plenty of gain on tap that gives me all the saturation I need. It sings like a bird, screams like a banshee, and there's plenty more in the tank if you want it. With the Mezzabarba, I find myself pushing the gain up to 7, 8, 9. And let me be clear, this is absolutely not a negative. This is very much just the way the amp is. It hasn't got obnoxious amounts of gain. It's been designed to be very usable throughout the whole range. A lot of the time, gain controls on amps are logarithmic. So you get from 0 to noon, you add lots of gain as you progress through that, and then you get more and more saturated, but not like in a good way. And by the time you're sort of 3/4 of the way down, you ends up just flubby and messy and not very nice. I had a 6505 years ago that was a lot like that. Like once you got past about 1 o'clock, it just became mushy and unusable. The Mezzabarba has very clearly been designed to be usable throughout the whole spectrum of all the controls. So let's jump into channel 3. So let's put channel 3 on maybe noon and we'll start there. Gain on 5, no boot. Like that roars, right? Now let's put the boost on. That's plenty of gain for most people. That sounds phenomenal. And now let's crank that up a little bit and really get into that kind of saturated, compressed territory. That's what I like an amp to sound like. So what are the negative points of the Mezzabarba? And I've got two. Number one, it's loud. And I mean really, really loud. So I'm used to playing JCM 800, a renowned loud amplifier. Playing live in an unmiked environment, I might run that master volume on 2.5, 3 without any attenuation into a 2x12 cabinet. More than loud enough to get over everything. In a mic'd environment, because of the mods that Dan has done to it, I can run that volume on more like 1.5, and still get a great tone out of it. So I can keep the onstage volume to a minimum and still get what I want from the amp. The Mezzabarba is different gravy. So there are two master volumes. There's one that you can engage as like a volume boost. I don't tend to use that. So far, the gigs that I've used with it, obviously the sound guy's been controlling my levels, so he'll just raise me up for solos and I haven't got to worry about it. And the idea is you set one slightly higher than the other, but I've only been using Master 1. It is just unbelievably loud. I've been playing this thing on large theatre stages. It's been in the wings with an amp guard around it, pointing at a wall, and I cannot get this thing over 1, if that, on the master volume. It's unbelievably loud. So if you're not playing arenas, let's be honest, how many of us are, you may want to consider some kind of attenuation or a load box or something to bring that volume down. Haven't used it in a live unmiked environment yet, and that will be a lot of fun, but not something I've done yet. The next drawback, and one I'm a little concerned about, is grounding. So I use a gig rig G3 on my pedal board. I don't have a lot of things on my board, but I do like the ability to parallel mix and loop switch and that kind of thing. And G3 has an amazing MIDI interface as well that I can control the amp with, because the channels, the bright cap, the boost are all controllable via MIDI. The way that you work with G3 is essentially you have you use the amp in a loop if you're using a 4-cable method. So you'd have your guitar goes in, you have a couple of loops where you're using your effects in front of the amp, like a compressor or an overdrive or a fuzz or whatever you're using. Then you'd have a loop that goes back to the input of the amp. Amp effects then comes back to the return of that loop in the G3, and then you progress through the other loops, so your time-based effects and modulation and things, and then you go sort of G3 out, back to the effects loop of the amp return. And I had a savage grounding issue doing it. Wasn't as prevalent or maybe even present on the JCM 800. So I don't necessarily think the problem is the G3. I tried using a gig rig Humding, I didn't really solve the problem. The only way that I could solve it was not to run the G3 in 4-cable method. So I'm basically sort of wireless pedal board, compressor, out to the amp, effects send, goes to the input of the G3, then I'm just using it to control my, delays, reverbs, and modulation, and obviously all of the MIDI for that. So I didn't think too much of it. I just thought, okay, maybe there's just some kind of weird, one of the pedals has a weird grounding issue or something, I don't know. And then I was at a gig at the weekend, and sound check, absolutely fine, no problems. Amp's nice and quiet at really, at comparatively loud volume. It's tame. It's not sitting there hissing obnoxiously. It's very controlled. And then showtime comes around. I'm in the wings. I flip the amp off of standby. And I, again, have this horrendous grounding problem. I've got this ground loop hum that will not go away. So I'm sitting there in the wings, there's a crowd full of people, and I'm like, my amp is sitting there buzzing. So I put it on the clean channel, and then just spent the gig going back to the clean channel whenever I wasn't playing to stop the hum from going on. It's not doing it now. It's not done it I did a couple of studio sessions before the gig. That was fine. I did a gig a few days prior to that. That was fine. It seems to be something that makes it acceptable to ground. I did find a video on YouTube that explained that for whatever reason the amp is grounded through the input jack, which is a little bit worrying. And maybe I'll take it to someone who knows more about amps than me and get them to re-ground it like this guy did. Maybe that's the root of the problem. I'm going to do a few more gigs with it, see if it resurfaces. If it does, maybe we'll look at that. As an amplifier, it is superb. It's one of the best sounding amps I've ever heard. It's super versatile. It's really usable and responsive. All of the bass, middle, treble, the presence, the feedback control on the back, which kind of does some magic that I don't fully understand, all work really well. You don't get to a point where it's, you add any more and you're just kind of muddying it up. They're all very responsive. The sound is phenomenal. The volume is more than you're ever going to need. It's just that grounding issue for me. So there you go. That is the Mezzabarba Trinity in a nutshell. I hope this has been fun, informative, and I'll catch you next time.